Welcome to Film 5D, the show about everything film with the Sony a7S II. I'm your host, Aaron Hammock, and this episode we're going to address a topic that I haven't touched in 5 years, white balance. So I first talked about white balance way back in the third episode, and to be honest, a lot has changed since then. Not necessarily in terms of new technology or anything like that, but more along the lines of the show and my personal growth. In fact, let's just take a quick look at that episode.
Dude, I don't know, man. I'm really messed up, dude.
We'll talk about this later.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry, it's just, white balance is pretty important. So. Wow, that was pretty freaking bad. I mean, look at this. My white balance was off in my episode about white balance. So essentially, that episode was about the different basic modes of white balance and setting up custom white balance specifically on the Canon 5D Mark II. Nowadays, any semi-prosumer camera can adjust these settings, so today I want to get away from the major settings and talk a bit more about motivation and why you should white balance and how you should consider doing it. Also, it often comes down to more than just settings on a camera or the color of the light you use. Other factors like using multiple colors of light or the quality of light can greatly impact your white balancing decisions and motivations. For example, in the episode I poked fun at before, where on the left, the key light is an LED set to a warm 3200 Kelvin, but the light on the right is a fluorescent bulb that was actually meant for lighting my green screen. This cheaper light source actually has a bit of a green cast that I was unaware of in the early days of the show. Now, I've actually seen professional photographers before shooting portraits with fluorescent video lights and wondering why they were getting inconsistent results. For example, a picture of one person might turn out okay, but then the next person with olive skin and blonde hair might wind up looking sick with their blonde hair being greenish. Now, the reason for this light quality, which is measured using the color rendering index or CRI, which is basically a calculation measuring from below 0 sometimes to 100 max. And that ultimately asks, the CRI ultimately asks the question, is the light source faithful to the subject? For example, fluorescent lights can have a CRI anywhere from 50 to 90, whereas LEDs average around 80 plus. But for really professional work, you really only want to be using lights with a CRI above 90. The Lowell lights that I use for my professional work have a CRI of 100 because they are tungsten halogen lights. And while these run very hot, it's one of the reasons I've yet to make the leap to LED for personal use. It's hard to find ones, that being LEDs, that are reasonably priced with a CRI over 95 plus. So once you get higher quality lights, you can start both lighting your subject and adjusting your white balance based on motivation. Now, one mistake that I made early on in the show was trying to white balance every single situation with my custom white balance, even when I was using, for example, red gels for my lights. Like in this skit, we had a strong red light source. I was obviously going for a kind of spooky tone, especially since it was a Halloween episode. However, initially I tried setting my white balance to counteract the red and ended up getting a greenish tint to my shot. It was in that moment almost 5 years ago that I realized that I did not need to white balance my shot so that the white was perfectly white. I actually just needed to set my white balance so the image looked like I wanted it to look in terms of the motivation that I was going for. And just a bit more on that subject of motivation in general, most of the times I'll use an orange or reddish light for a cozy, calm, or inviting situation, but I could also use it for a horror scene like I did in that skit. Or I might use a bluish light for a more invigorating feeling, or especially something like an interrogation scene. You can also mix light colors for different effects as well. You'll often see a shot like for a movie or even an interview where they use tungsten or warm lights to light the subject with the key and the fill, but then a cooler light for the hair, rim, or backlight, whatever you want to call it, which can add some additional separation for your subject from your background. Sometimes I have a particularly flat shot and I'll add a cooler or warmer light to the background to also add an additional separation. So my front lights will be a different color than the light lighting my background, like if it's in a studio or in someone's house or apartment or in a hotel. I'll just kind of add a little bit of separation. Now this doesn't work for every situation, but you should definitely give it a try the next time you set up an interview or a testimonial. But back to white balance. Last time I talked briefly about the Kelvin scale, and most of you have probably seen something like this linear scale here that moves up in Kelvin from left to right, also getting cooler from left to right. However, this isn't actually the best representation of how your camera will measure white balance in different situations. In fact, there are some lights you might run into, especially certain fluorescent lights, that you will not be able to properly white balance in terms of using the basic Kelvin scale without going straight for custom white balance. That's why I like to picture the Kelvin scale like this. Here you can see the usually straight Kelvin scale being represented along a curve. It's particularly important to note those tangents you see are essentially just changing of hue. Oftentimes you might set your white balance for somewhere around 4400K when shooting in fluorescent lighting, but you will still have a lingering greenish tint to your shot. Thus you will have to go into advanced Kelvin settings on your camera, like you can see here on my A7S, and shift the color a bit towards magenta. Now the rule of thumb is that you always want to get as much right in camera as possible, and honestly that includes white balance. Unless you are shooting raw, you really want to be shooting in the corrected and/or motivated white balance you plan to be using for the final version. Although sometimes when I'm not quite sure what my look will end up being, I just shoot right in the middle with the skin tones of my subject, assuming that there's a subject in the shot, matching what I actually see through my own eyes, sans camera. But that's it for this episode. If you like this content, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel for additional content every single Monday if you haven't already. Also, I started writing my weekly blog again, which includes additional content to my videos here on YouTube, so head on over to filmandfid.com, my new website, to check it out. I'll be back next week to give you my tips for optimizing your YouTube videos.